about asylum seekers today. I have done quite a bit of work with children, but in the context of refugees and people seeking asylum. The term to seek asylum means to go across a border to another country and to ask the country for protection as a refugee. It's a very complicated area of law, and I am aware that in Korea you do not have very many people who claim asylum here. I know there are very many people who would like to claim asylum here, but it is too hard for them to get across the border to claim asylum, I think. So what I want to do is to take us from the big discussion of the rights of the child to one part of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I want to talk about, sorry, which one do I pick? This one? This one? Okay. That one there. Which one do? This one? That one? I'm sorry, excuse me. I want to talk about one part of the most important article in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It is it's a phrase or a term that I think captures the most important aspects of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that really embodies the idea of respect for the child and care for the child, and indeed everything. I want to talk about the phrase best interests and the phrase in the best interests of the child. Article 3, which I have put up on the board for you here, reads, "In all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration." Now, the notion of best interests has been central to international children's rights since the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. I want to talk about it today because it is so important, but also because it is so difficult to define. It is so difficult that it has taken nearly 25 years for the Committee on the Rights of the Child to issue a general statement, a general comment on the meaning of it. And one of the reasons why I chose this topic is because this is the year that the committee chose to do that. Now, as it has been enacted in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the concept of best interests is both all-powerful and very limited. It is powerful because it applies to all actions, whether undertaken by public or by private bodies, by courts of law, by institutions, by your parents, by everybody. It is limited because, look, it says the best interests shall be a primary consideration, yes, number one consideration, but a primary consideration. What is difficult about that is that it's not the only consideration. And what it means is that governments everywhere, people everywhere, have read this to say, well, we would love this to be the number one consideration, but politics or many other considerations mean, sorry, we have to put the child second. Yeah. So, it has been, I think, the most revolutionary aspect of the Convention, because of that word primary consideration. For many, many, many years, it has also been a little disregarded, though, because they say, well, best interest, what does it mean? It is too indeterminate. It's fuzzy-wuzzy. You know, it doesn't have a hard meaning that we can understand. Thank you to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, because they are now, the committee has really explained that this phrase is tied to the whole of the Convention, and in fact, I will argue that the content is not fuzzy-wuzzy, indeterminate, but it actually stands for the Convention and for all of the ways that we should be looking after the child. The content of this principle comes from the Convention. It comes from all the other rights. The committee makes a point in their general comment that for children there is no hierarchy of rights, not one right that is more important than another. A child is entitled to all the rights in the Convention. So, best interests means the child is loved and safe. Achieving all material basics. All the elements that we saw drawn out so beautifully in the last panel discussion, and in fact the whole of this afternoon, that the child will be safe, that the child will be fed, the child will have the right to sleep, the child will have the right to play, the child will have the right to be healthy, the child has a right to be educated, to learn, to develop, to participate, to be respected. This, for me, is what best interests means. But I am a refugee lawyer. Let us look at the situation of children when they present without a country. Yeah? A refugee is a person without a country. What happens to the child when they present without a country and they seek our protection? Well, the first thing that I want to explore in my paper, and I do apologise that I did not have the full paper ready for translation before my speech, but it will be put up on the website and it is available now. The committee, in its general comment, make the point that best interests is three things. It is about a right, it is about a principle, and it is about a rule of procedure. Now, I am very grateful to the committee because they have given us a way to organise all of the rights in a way that allows us to spell out exactly what this means in practice on the ground. Because I'm a very practical woman, you know. I still work with people who are seeking asylum, so I'm not very good at just the big ideas. I need to be able to understand how it will work. First thing to notice about the notion, the idea of best interests in the context of refugees is that children crossing borders, children suffering from major upheavals, is as old as human history. And we saw that today, that each of our heroes that we studied this afternoon, they really rose up in response to particular events that had a terrible impact on children. The problem with children when they move across the border is that states like the integrity of their borders, and unfortunately there has been a tendency to treat children just like adults in miniature in many ways, but seeing them as irregular migrants before they see them as children. And that has been one of the biggest problems with our concept of best interest. Because while our understanding of the rights of children have developed, the rights of asylum seeker children, unfortunately, seems to take a different path. We know what we should be doing, but we are not doing what we should be doing. Now, the way I would put it to you is that there is a good story in children's rights and a bad story. The bad story is that at every stage of the asylum process, and I'm just going to take 3 stages, I called it my article, First Things First. I want to look at with you what happens when the child first seeks asylum in 3 parts. First, when they are asking, put their hand up and say, I want protection as a refugee. Secondly, when their claim is being processed. And thirdly, how they are cared for while they are in that process. This is only like the beginning of the journey that children make when they seek asylum in another country. It's a very, very long story. The problem is that we know that we should be seeing children. They present all around the world. Any flow of refugees around the world, between 5 and 10% are children. We are finding that, between 5 and 10% are children who are travelling without a responsible adult. Children travelling alone, seeking asylum alone. It's become a consistent but perhaps even a growing phenomenon around the world. Over half of the world's population of refugees, however, are children. And what we find is that the world, countries everywhere, have been blind to children at 2 levels. When they travel with their parents, we look at their parents and we don't count the children. When they travel by themselves, we have to look at them because they are alone. But we find every excuse not to treat them as children first, but rather to look at best interests as a second or even third priority. What we are doing around the world is we are stopping children and stopping asylum seekers from accessing protection at all. And sadly, my country, Australia, at the moment is really one of the worst examples. We have a policy where if people come by boat, only if they come by boat, that they will be removed to another country instead of being accepted in Australia where they claim asylum. So we are sending people who come by boat to Nauru and to Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, where they are living in conditions that are just appalling. Manus Island, they're living in tents. There is malaria, disease, that don't have the hospitals to treat people. And unfortunately, for the sake of trying to stop people from going on the boats, we are totally ignoring the best interests of the child. The second point that I want to talk about is identification of the children. Unfortunately, many states are suspicious of older-looking children, and they subject them to really nasty tests, invasive and I think unreliable tests to see what their age is. Of course, in order to respect and to look after a child, you have to determine whether first they are a child or not. And again, we have had states, America, Australia, some European states too, that use X-rays and very invasive methods that really seem to me to be designed more to say, you are 18, so we don't have to treat you as a child. For me, I find that very disturbing anyway, because my children now are 24, 25. I still see them very much as children who need to be protected. But I understand that states do have to try to determine the age of children. The good story, though, I think, is that there are some states, and the United Kingdom is a good example, where they have really adopted the best interest principle with age determinations to develop a process that is truly respectful of children, that looks at the whole child, not just whether their bones have developed, whether their growth plate is still active, but rather they look at their psychosocial development, their linguistic, cognitive functioning, and a holistic range of matters to look at how a child is. So that has to be a good part of the story. Over the years, I think that the understanding of the needs of children travelling alone or children travelling with parents in search of asylum has grown. And we this year have been in the process of developing guidelines for the processing of children and the care of children while they are in that very vulnerable stage of first seeking protection as refugees. It's interesting that there are some countries around the world that stand out as very good examples of how you should behave. One of them is Canada, the other is England. It's interesting that Canada wrote guidelines for the processing of claims by children before any other country. They published their first guidelines in 1996, and the US followed very soon afterwards in 1998. What I find interesting is that Canada wrote guidelines in 1996, but after that, nothing. It hasn't changed at all. So they were one of the first, the pioneers, but after that, perhaps they haven't kept up as much as everyone else. Even Australia, partly through work that I was involved in between 2003 and 2006, we also became much more aware. And what I find very interesting that I write about in my article is that in my country there has been a real divide open between the law and the practice on the ground. On the ground, the best interests for the people who have to work with the children, they are very conscious now that if you want to hear a child's story, you must ask them the question first. Unfortunately, the law in Australia still says nothing about children in the asylum process. A child may be consulted, but there is no obligation to ask the question of every child, every asylum seeker who comes to the country. In Canada, in New Zealand, in England, every person has to have a claim assessed. Now, still, if one member of the family is accepted as a refugee, the others can all be accepted too. But if you don't ask, how can you know whether a child has got a special claim? Because children can be refugees in the same way as an adult, clearly. They can be victims of discrimination, of racial hatred, but only children can be subjected to some forms of harm. Only children can be placed at risk of forced marriage. Children are uniquely vulnerable, uniquely susceptible if they are placed in a situation of harm. If you slap an adult, they will survive. If you do the same action to a child, maybe they will die. Yeah? So, if we look at children in a way that doesn't see them at all, that does not ask about what harms they would face if they are returned, then we will miss their refugee claim altogether. Yeah? So, I began to say that in Australia the law still remains very bad. On the ground, our officials have tried to make up the difference in the way that they behave. And I feel very sorry for them because sometimes our politicians in Australia are saying terrible things, and yet our officials, they must handle the people on the ground. And in my experience, they are reading the literature on best interests. They are understanding what has to occur, and they are actually doing their best to try and help children. Where the law in Australia is particularly bad, though, is in the care and welfare of the children. Now, the officials try very hard to get the children out and living in the community as quickly as they come. But the law still says if you come without permission, without a visa, then you must be detained. So today, in spite of everybody's best action, we have more children in detention in Australia than at any other time in our history, which is really sad. We know that detention, locking children up, particularly where we lock them up in very remote locations, sometimes on an island that is ironically called Christmas Island. It's not very like Christmas at all. Scrooge's Island, perhaps. Or in the middle of the desert. It causes enormous harm to the children. So, where do we go from here? How can we promote the best interests of children who seek asylum? I think the first and most basic step is to use best interests as a principle. This means applying it as a way to interpret the law and the policy at every step. This approach gives you room to accommodate in asylum processes to make the outcomes more favourable to children. It means that states should consider the interests of children when they formulate policy and law at the highest level, and where the law is already decided, they should interpret the law in a way that is helpful to children. An example is where legislation permits or requires detention of asylum seekers in exceptional circumstances. Children should always be regarded as an exceptional circumstance because detention is never in the best interests of a child. A more sophisticated response is also to accept best interests as a rule of procedure and therefore to modify procedures wherever children are involved so that their best interests can be properly and meaningfully considered. There are now very good examples from all over the world of asylum policies and procedures that can be adapted to recognise and protect best interests. Finally, let us allow best interests to be protected as a right. This is very hard for our politicians and for all states to accept because it puts the child's substantive right to have their best interests protected above a state's conflicting imperative towards immigration control and deterrence. But for me, it is why I write as an academic, it is why I'm not ready to retire, and it is what I think we should all commit our lives to as a struggle that will probably never end. But let's do it. Thank you. Sorry, I had to read it. That is a little boy who's in detention in Darwin, which is to the north of Australia.